You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Feel like who art ed?
We'll try to slice it.
Who art is Mr. Wood art ed me?
Good. Either way, it's ambiguous. It works on so many levels.
I know.
That's off to a great start.
Welcome to Who Arted, Weekly Art History for All Ages. I'm your host, Kyle Wood, and today I am really excited. My guest is Karli Wurzelbacher, the curator of the Heckscher Museum of Art, with a new exhibition on an artist that I honestly was not familiar with, Emma Stebbins. And so this is just like hitting all my favorite things. I love when I get to talk to a curator. I love discovering new artists and learning from people smarter than me. So thank you so much for joining me, Karli Wurzelbacher.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm excited to be here and to speak with you and your listeners about Emma Stebbins.
Yeah. So before we get into Emma Stebbins, I do want to talk about, I got to plug the pluggables right off the bat. You've got an exhibition of her work at the museum. Can you tell listeners who might be in the area, where's the museum? What's happening with this show? I believe it's her first solo exhibition, retrospective, however you want to call it. I'll let you do the talking because clearly I can't handle it.
Sure. So you're right. This is Emma Stebbins' first ever museum exhibition, despite her importance, which we'll be speaking about. The exhibition is on view at the Heckscher Museum right now. The Heckscher is in Huntington, New York, which is about 30 miles outside of New York City on Long Island. We are free and open to the public, so we'd love to have you visit. The show is on view until March 15 of 2026, so we've still got a few months. And it brings together 14 of her marble sculptures, as well as some archival material.
Oh, fantastic. And I always love museums that are free and open to the public. Like, that is such a wonderful gift that I just always want to encourage people to take advantage of. If you're in the area, there are so many gems of museums, and I love that you're putting together this exhibition and that it's open to everyone. So if you're in the New York area, make time, check it out. But now let's get into Emma and why this exhibition is so important and groundbreaking. Can you start off, tell us a little bit about her work? Just like, who was Emma as an artist, but also like a human being?
Okay. So Emma Stebbins was a New Yorker. She was born in New York City in 1815. And we don't know a lot about the first few decades of her life. We know that her family was very interested in culture and the arts, and so she probably did have a great education learning from other artists in the city. And then at age 40, she moved to Rome. And so she would have done that by sailing on a steamship from New York City to Liverpool and then London, and then working her way down into Italy. And she decides to live in Rome and become a sculptor. And she works in marble, so stone carving. And then she also made public monuments in bronze. And there are two important monuments that she created that are still on view. One is a statue of Horace Mann, who was an important early educator, and that is in Boston. And the other is perhaps her best known work. It's called the Bethesda Fountain, and it's in Central Park. And some people who don't know art necessarily still know this monument because it's in lots of popular films like the movie Elf or Home Alone 2. It's kind of an icon of the city, so it shows up in popular culture also.
It's amazing that, someone who's made a piece that is so widely recognizable would be a name that is not equally widely recognizable, right? Like I've seen the image, I know the work, but I hadn't, and I'm on the periphery of the art world. I was not familiar with Emma Stebbins and her work. I mean, maybe it's just sculpture's not my thing, but not my thing. I don't mean to dismiss it. It's just like I was never good at it. But when I think about 19th century sculptor and artist. The first parallel I think of is like Edmonia Lewis was doing fantastic work, I believe, around the same time period. And she also went to Europe. Was it just like everybody who was anyone had to go to Europe to get the formal sort of like training and see the Renaissance works in person in Italy? Or were there other like reasons? Did she just, prefer the climate and the scenery?
I think it's all of the above. And so you're right. Edmonia Lewis is someone that Emma Stebbins would have known. Emma Stebbins was a bit older, and she went to Rome a little bit sooner, but they were there at the same time. And it's all the things you're saying. So Rome is really, even before Paris, it's the center of the international art world in the mid 19th century. So 1850s, 1860s. And so American artists are going to Rome, but so are British artists, so are German artists. And people are congregating there because they are visiting the Vatican and the Capitoline Museum, and they are finding inspiration in ancient Greek and Roman art. They're also in Rome because Carrara marble comes from Carrara, Italy. It's actually a mountain of marble. And so it's easier to access the material when you're there in Rome. Rome also had a wonderful system of professional stone carvers and professional artist models. So there's a whole art ecosystem in Rome that just did not exist, especially for women artists in New York City or elsewhere in the United States during Emma Stebbins' lifetime.
Yeah, and I guess, when you talk about the Carrara marble, I mean, we would have been talking about literally shipping tons of marble halfway around the world. Just logistically, that is quite the challenge. Even today, that's no small feat. So I guess that makes sense. And now that I'm thinking about it, I feel almost silly for asking the question, because as you're talking about like, the works that they were looking at and the inspiration, like, of course they're looking at these ancient Greek and Roman pieces. She was a neoclassical artist, right?
Right.
So the neoclassical artists, they were all about the tradition and things being rooted in the style of ancient Rome and ancient Greece, although the Greeks, I think, were a lot of bronzes that get melted down. So we kind of understand it through the Roman works. I understand? I really want to make sure that I'm, getting the facts right as I talk about this. That is the way it went, right?
Yes. So the Greeks kind of come first, and they are making these what we now call classical works, idealized depictions of the human body, muscular figures, athletes and heroes and mythological figures. They're doing that in bronze, which is metal. The ancient Romans are then looking at the Greeks, and they're making their own copies and their own versions of these classical antique sculptures. And they're doing that in marble. And so today, often what survives are the marbles, not the bronzes. So you're correct. We're seeing the Greeks through the lens of the Romans. And that's what Stebbins and her peers are mostly looking at, are those Roman marble sculptures.
So then, with her work as she's developing her style, that neoclassical was new classical, a lovely term, which, don't think about too much. But the new classical work was kind of taking that contrapposto pose, or like what were the elements of classical sculpture that she was taking and applying in her work, but what was the new element in there?
So the classical part, working in the same material in marble, sculpting the human form. So not sculpting animals or flowers, but really fixating on human beings, and kind of the most beautiful version of human beings. And so these are idealized figures. They're not specific people. They're not portraits. They're allegories of big ideas like truth or beauty or justice, and they're embodied in the idealized human form. Where it becomes new, I think, in Stebbins' work is taking those poses and those attitudes, but then folding in references to the events of her time or her personal life. And so some of the works we might talk about depict a sailor or a coal miner or a machinist, someone who's making metal parts for a factory. So those are certainly different subjects than the ancient Romans would have been depicting.
Now, for that, would she have been using them in that same sort of allegorical fashion? Would she have been doing like a sailor to represent all sailors rather than like this specific sailor that I know?
Yes, exactly. So a lot of the titles are even kind of doubled. So one work in the show is titled Commerce, parentheses, also known as sailor. So it's the figure of a sailor standing for all sailors, but even more than that, standing for the idea of commerce, for the exchange, the trade between nations that the United States is entering into increasingly in the 19th century. So, right, it's taking like really big ideas and having one human figure symbolize that.
Now, as she's doing this work, obviously she got some high profile commissions. You talked about the one in New York in Central Park. Can you tell us a little bit about like her rise and maybe like how she became, forgotten or lesser known, or you know what I'm saying? Because obviously,
Yes.
like that kind of piece, even though New York might have been smaller at the time, it was still a pretty big city, right? So like that was a high profile commission, high profile gig. How did she get, I don't want to say lost to history, but a little bit lost to history?
Yeah, I think that's right. And the title of the show is Emma Stebbins Carving Out History, because we're carving back out this space that she had occupied. So during her lifetime, she is internationally famous. When she sails from New York to Rome, her travels are reported in the newspaper. When upper and middle class Americans themselves go on the grand tour and go to Rome, you could buy a guidebook and it would tell you the artists' addresses so that you could visit their studios and talk to them and see them working. Those people would often write back to their hometown newspapers about what they were seeing in Stebbins' studio. She falls out of the history books after her death in 1882, and a few things are happening there. One, women's achievements are not interesting to historians at that time. And so historians who didn't know her and who didn't live during the time are writing histories of American sculpture, and they're leaving her out. In part, that's because also neoclassicism in general, whomever was sculpting in that way, really fell sharply out of style with the rise of more naturalistic, realistic art, and then certainly with the rise of modern art, neoclassicism was seen as outdated and not relevant and not interesting. And so the entire style falls out of fashion. And it's not until after the feminist art movement of the 1970s and when Stebbins' story and the work of other women artists is kind of recovered and brought back to the forefront. And then that also coincides with a reappraisal of the neoclassical style.
It's interesting because in so many ways, I feel like neoclassicism shouldn't be so in opposition to modernism, because I feel like both movements were so conceptually driven about these big ideas, allegories, and trying to make something that is timeless. But I guess every movement is somewhat a backlash against, that which came before, but also learning from that which came before, It's interesting and kind of sad when you think about it, because there's a lot of great stuff that people kind of overlooked. But we are going to take time to look at those pieces. So after a short break, I want to get into some of the specific work that you have in your amazing exhibition. Welcome back. My guest today is Karli Wurzelbacher, the curator at the Heckscher Museum of Art in New York. And we've got the exhibition of Emma Stebbins, the first museum exhibition of Emma Stebbins' work, which is absolutely amazing. I've seen pictures of it. I have yet to see it in person. But I guess before we get into the specific piece, which listeners you can see on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening, but can you tell us how these pieces were created? Because she's a sculptor, but she's working from a block of marble, and that's a subtractive process. And for listeners not familiar with what does that even mean, can you just walk us through how a piece like this would be created?
Sure. So it starts even before the marble. So Stebbins, first it starts kind of in the brain, right? So you're thinking and feeling and pondering what your subject matter will be. For neoclassical artists, then you're looking at those ancient references, you're looking at literature, Homer's Odyssey or biblical stories, thinking about what you want to fold into your artwork. And then you start with a sketch, but this would be a 3D sketch in clay. So they would start with a small clay model, just roughly massing out what the pose is going to be, the composition. And then once that is set, the artist would then scale up the model to the same size that they wanted the finished work in marble to be. So they're still working in clay now, but creating a more perfectly finished clay sculpture, because you don't want to start, and this is where modernism and neoclassicism is different. A neoclassical artist doesn't want to start working on the marble block till they know exactly what they're doing, because as you say, it's subtractive. So if you knock off a piece, you can't really glue it back on. Once you've removed the material, it's gone. And the marble's expensive and it's time consuming. So they don't want to touch the marble till they know exactly what they're doing. So then the clay model that I've been describing would have actually been cast in plaster, and that's to preserve it. The plaster is more durable than the clay. And then once you finally got the plaster, you can use that. You can work from that in what was called a pointing system. So it's a way of measuring, okay, how wide is the leg? How tall is the leg? And then you can mock up on your marble where you're going to start knocking off the corners and start roughing out the shape. And then you can get into finer details and chiseling, and then finally just sanding down and polishing the form. So it's a very lengthy process. It would take months to realize the final work.
Yeah, it is amazing how much thought goes into one of these types of sculptures. And I said, it's not my thing. I studied art. I got a BFA. I was more of a painter because I just, if I'm being 100% honest, I don't have it in me to do that quality of work like that. The refinement I absolutely love, and I admire it from the people who did it well. And so you shared with me the images that we're putting in as the episode art. Can you tell us about this work? And I guess, to start at the beginning, you talked about the concepts driving the work. Was Emma creating this sort of on spec, hoping an audience would find it, or was this a commissioned piece? Where did what was the genesis of it?
Yeah. So in general, it could happen in either way. Either someone contacts her and says, I want a sculpture of a certain thing, and she works with the patron. Or sometimes she's generating her own ideas and hoping to find the buyer later. So with the images that we are talking about, we shared two. Are we
Industry
able to
and
share?
commerce, right?
Yes. Yeah. The pair, industry and commerce, was a commission from the Heckscher Museum, was founded by August Heckscher. The commission came from his uncle, Charles Heckscher, which is how the Heckscher Museum came to own these Emma Stebbins works. So Charles Heckscher said to Emma Stebbins, I would like two sculptures that relate to my business interests. And Charles Heckscher made his money through coal mining and through shipping, both the railroad and sailboats. And so he gives Emma this big assignment, and then it's up to her to figure out, okay, how did this guy make his money? What is his business? And what can I do with that artistically? So she's the one who then decides that she is going to symbolize these two industries in the forms of a coal miner and a sailor. And so what's really different and novel about her work is many neoclassical artists, when you think about those ancient Greek and Roman statues, often they're nude or they're in classical drapery. And Stebbins kind of realizes that that would be odd, frankly, for a miner and a sailor. And she's one of the first American artists to actually depict human figures in contemporary clothing, the same types of dress that people walking on the street would have been wearing. And so she takes the art out of this kind of timeless realm, and she does root it in the specifics of 1850s, 1860s American labor.
Oh, that is an interesting little twist. I do like that. And the other thing that I really like about the way that she's, dressing them, I guess. And this is like me just admiring the work because I was never good at it. But like I am just so in awe of her ability to like capture the detail of the fabric, the texture of the hair, these stylistic elements that ground it in her time and make it relatable to for her contemporary audience. Even though it kind of dates it in a way, obviously, but it's this interesting fusion of like, well, the marble and that monochrome of the marble gives it this timeless air that harkens back to the ancient, even though, studies have shown the ancient Roman marbles were actually painted and much more colorful than we're used to seeing them in. It still gives it that ancient feel, and yet it's also a little bit, I shouldn't say modern because of the fact that we're in an art context and everything, but it feels more up to date, more current, more relatable to the audience of that day. And I think that's an interesting balance.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's she is responding to modernity. Certainly, the world is changing. She's, the railroad is getting up and running in her lifetime. Photography is invented during her lifetime. So the world is changing and speeding up, and these kind of aspects of modern life are things that she's experiencing, even though the art style is not modernism as we know it, but she is responding to a changing world.
And so, if we can dig into the allegory here, we're talking about the modern world and these figures representing industry and commerce. Which one is industry and which one is commerce?
Sure. So industry is the coal miner.
Okay.
And the Heckschers had owned coal mines in Pennsylvania. And there's actually a small town called Heckscherville in Pennsylvania. And they employed coal miners. And so what's interesting is that while in some ways, as we're discussing, the coal miner here is more realistic, more naturalistic, more relatable. At the same time, this is still a symbol of industry. This is not what an actual coal miner looks like, because an actual coal miner is not so pristine, sparkling white. They're dirty. They're working underground. It's really difficult physical labor. So this is a kind of sanitized, cleaned up version of a miner, and this is a miner at rest. When we know that actual miners were often immigrants. Charles Heckscher was not paying them very well. And so Stebbins is presenting this idealized, glorified view of American labor that doesn't match up with really the actual lived reality of these workers. So there's an interesting tension. She's the first person to picture laborers at all. But she is still taking some artistic license because she's making this for the owner of the mine.
Yeah, and that is an interesting perspective because, it presents the miner as an important figure. I mean, to elevate the worker to the same marble statue as we would see from like Apollo or David or any of these other like grand historical, it roots them in that tradition and puts them on the same level as these highly revered figures. But on the other hand, there is something about the fact that like it's a sanitized version of what their life was, and it's an image that feels very sort of placid and enjoyable. Like he seems at rest, just casually holding it over his shoulder. Like it there doesn't seem to be much weight there, and I think that does probably make the owner of the mine feel a little bit better if that's his vision of what the workers are looking like, because it's not the reality, but it's pleasant to look at.
Yeah. And that's what makes it interesting to talk about today. The slippage between those things and different views of labor at that time, and the ways that Stebbins was pushing the envelope, but, she can only go so far.
Yeah. I mean, you're ultimately working for the patron. So that's the person whose vision you're going to be, satisfying to some extent. And, with commerce, tell me about this guy. How is this representing commerce?
So commerce is, he's got his hand on his hip. He's leaning against either a part of a ship, or maybe, I don't know my nautical terms, the thing you tie your boat up to.
I don't have the high ground on that one. Don't worry. The rope thingy is good enough for me.
Yes. So he's leaning on this bollard or some kind of plinth, and it has rope coiled all around it. It's incredibly detailed, the way she's rendered the spiral fibers of this rope. And he's really, again, like the miner, he's kind of jaunty and jolly and at ease and having a good time. And you don't get a sense of the danger that would have come with oceanic shipping or, again, this is a very youthful, very healthy figure. And so it's a very optimistic picture of this idea of commerce. Again, created for the man who's running the company, not the people who are actually doing the sailing or actually doing the transportation.
Yeah. And again, I would say it's interesting that these two figures come together. They almost look like bookends, the way they're, at least in the renderings I'm looking at, because there is that weight to one side and they're leaning against something, which all of this feels so much like, the classic influence, the stance where it's like one leg's engaged and they're leaning a little bit. There's that slight asymmetry that brings it to life, and I always find that really interesting as I'm looking more and learning more about art history and doing this show. Is you see all these little details, and you in the start of this discussion about these two pieces, you said these were the first commissioned for the museum.
So these works, Charles Heckscher commissioned them for his home first.
Okay.
But before he brought them to his house, Stebbins showed them at an art gallery in New York City. So these were seen by the public in New York City in 1860. And they're written about in the New York Times in glowing terms. And the critics say that these sing with the spirit of American labor, and they're very well received. And then they go into the Heckscher home. And then eventually they are donated by the Heckscher family members to what is now the Heckscher Museum of Art. So the works were created in 1860. Mm-hmm. The Heckscher Museum is not founded until 1920. But in the 20s, we acquired these works through the family. And the Heckscher Museum then becomes the first art museum in the country to collect Emma Stebbins' work. So the other marbles were still in private hands. They weren't in any other museum collections until only in the 1980s would they begin to enter other museum collections.
So I guess I'm trying to think like the broader narrative here. So it sounds like these were pieces that, he had in his personal collection, which is great, but, exhibited to the public, like you said. And if I'm thinking about these allegorically, because you'll have to help me out on this, because I'm trying to straighten out my thoughts on this. I'm trying to think like the critics are seeing this. What's the story she's telling of commerce? Is this like, look at us, our modern industry and commerce, America's on its way, sort of patriotic, like industry happening or like industrial revolution, progress going forward. This is the new look of the tradition that's gone so far, and sort of a new take on what had been thought of as like the old world. Because I'm thinking of how like in the early days of America, American art was seen as kind of less than European in a lot of ways. And I feel like the 19th and 20th century is where America more found its footing and its voice. And is this a part of that broader development of the American art scene?
Yes. So as you say, these sculptures are completed in 1860. So America is not even 100 years old yet. So this is still a youngish country who still, wants to be taken seriously on the world stage with the storied European countries, culturally and economically. And so the critics and the general public are interested in this American subject matter. And they are interested in the fact that even though Stebbins made them in Rome, first of all, they're proud that Stebbins and Edmonia Lewis and other American women are having such success in Rome. That's kind of a mark of the country on the rise and its culture developing. So they're really proud of their countrymen and countrywomen working in Rome. Mm-hmm. And they are really appreciative of the way that Stebbins is placing American commerce and industry in this long artistic tradition going back to ancient Rome. And so that's part of neoclassicism too. We're talking about sculpture right now, but if you think about the architectural style of Washington, D.C., or of many college campuses or other schools or libraries, there's a sense that the classical world is where democracy was born and also where culture was born and the arts. And America wants to be part of that visually. And that's what Stebbins is kind of delivering in these two figures and in her other work.
Okay, so it's sort of like a, the American new chapter in this story of progress going forward and culture on the rise and everything. Yeah, that makes sense. And you said that much more clearly and articulately than I could. So thank you. I was struggling to wrap my brain around that because despite what I do here, art is something that I don't get intuitively. If I'm being 100% honest, I do this because I have to study and I have to talk to people who are smarter than me to make sense of it. So I really appreciate that. Now, sure. After one last short break, I want to talk a little bit more about the exhibition, why you feel it's important, why everyone needs to see it, and everyone needs to know this name, Emma Stebbins. Welcome back. My guest is Karli Wurzelbacher from the Heckscher Museum of Art. We've got this collection of work by Emma Stebbins. We've learned a bit about her and, you know, her biography, her work, but can you tell us why is this an important collection for people to see today? What are some of the threads that people might pick up on? What do you hope people appreciate, or why might it be relevant to an audience, you know, going on well over 100 years later?
Yeah, so I think that I've got a multi-part answer here.
Good, because I asked you like 10 questions in there. You can just pick which ones are worthwhile.
Okay. Well, I think first, her personal life and her personal story is very inspirational. And it also shows that women were at the center of American culture, even 150 years ago, that wasn't new or scary or shocking. So Emma Stebbins moves to Rome at age 40 to dedicate her life to making sculpture at a time when many upper and middle class women of her same station were getting married and having families and not working outside the home. She decides to go in this other direction. And in Rome, she meets the love of her life, Charlotte Cushman, who was a famous actress. And the two of them set up a household in Rome. And they are the most well-respected, the most famous Americans in Rome. And everyone is visiting at their house and wants to talk to them. So again, these are two women at the heart of American culture. So 150 years ago. So I think that's really interesting. And then also the work that Stebbins is making still touches on a lot of these topics that we think about today. So we've talked a lot about industry and commerce and the effect that those had on the environment. That's also kind of built into her work. At the beginning of our discussion, we talked about the Bethesda Fountain in Central Park, which is actually about health and healing and clean water. So Stebbins made that work to celebrate the Croton Aqueduct, which basically is this massive plumbing project that brings clean water to New York City in response to cholera epidemics and other diseases caused by pollution. And Stebbins' own father dies of cholera. So this issue of clean water and health is really an important issue to her personally, but important to New York City. And these are still things we talk about today, the environment and health and healing. So people are still able to connect with her art, connect with the meanings of her work, even all these years later.
Yeah. And I hadn't thought about, I mean, the water you don't take as a really important issue until there's something wrong with it. You know, those plumbing projects and the importance of good water. It's all these little things about our infrastructure that we often don't think about, but are absolutely crucial to our health and our well-being. And it's kind of amazing and also kind of sad that people were grappling with these same issues 150 years ago. I mean, we're doing better, but still there's a lot of room for growth. Although I will say it is kind of cool that, she was doing these things where she's reframing the work, and thinking about representation of the figures, the workers, and all of that at a time when that was probably less common.
Right. And even with her angel, and she sculpts other angels, what's interesting is that in the Bible, angels and archangels are often gendered male. They're not
Mhm.
human beings, but so they're not men or women, but it's Archangel Michael, Archangel Gabriel. Today, I think we conceive of angels as women or as female characters. But for Stebbins to sculpt the Bethesda Fountain with a visibly female, feminine angel at the top was another one of these breaks from tradition that in art history you don't see female angels. So that's another example where she's working within a tradition, but pushing against it a little bit because she has this unique perspective.
I hadn't thought about like angels being gendered, and I guess that's because I went to a Catholic school named St. Mike's, so like I spent years, almost a decade of my life in a place where it was just that one image of the angel all the time. But I hadn't thought about. But you're right. They probably always were male, and I just didn't really think about the gender of any of these figures. But that's kind of cool that she's finding ways to be subtly subversive within the structure, the traditions and everything that you kind of have to fall in line with, because
Right.
you can only push things so far. And still have people on board with your vision.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You can't completely, and this is also where neoclassicism is different from modernism or the avant-garde. You can't be breaking things. You can't be totally rebelling against the art system. If you want patrons and you want recognition, and you want to be celebrated as a skilled, successful, smart artist, you do have to work within the conventions of your time in the 19th century. But she does find these ways, as you said, subtly subversive ways to put her own personal stamp or her own twist on these familiar elements. And that's why her work really stands out today when we look back.
Yeah, and I think, that's I think that's probably always going to be true. You have to push things for incremental change because, the modernists, as revolutionary as modern movements were, and I am largely a modernist at heart, I think it was a movement that left behind a lot of people. A lot of people looked at modern work and were just like, I don't have an entry point to this. I'm struggling to make sense of this. And what I find interesting about Stebbins' work is that I can find several entry points. I can see a figure that's dressed up in, what would have been current clothing for the time, and you can recognize it on that level. I can look at it as a continuation of historical traditions, as we've already talked about. But like there are ways to get in there, and then you start to see like, oh, well, this is slightly different than what I initially conceived of through the classical lens or whatever, and so then that little bit of dissonance creates space for me to think about it and make connections and to understand it. So she kind of helps bring you along to some other place, which I think is really cool. I always love when an artist does that.
Yeah. What I like when I'm talking to students or even training our docents, before I start talking and giving all this facts and historical information, I just put up the image and I just say, describe what you see and how it makes you feel or what it makes you think about and why. And with Emma Stebbins' work, a group of 50 docents really got it. just visually before I had said a word. So it does, ultimately that's the interesting thing about writing about art and talking about art. The best art is communication in itself. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't need all of these words we weave around it. Although the more information and historical context you have, just the richer it becomes.
Yeah. You don't need the words around it, but you do need to like, subscribe, and follow so I can keep doing the podcast.
And you do need to buy the book about Emma Stebbins that accompanies the show.
Absolutely. I'm feeling so bad. I didn't even plug the book. I was so focused on talking about the exhibition, but listeners, absolutely check the links in the show notes. I'll put links to the museum, the show, and the book. Absolutely. But before, we wrap up, I do want to remind listeners, if they want to check out these works in person, can you tell us what were the dates on the show again?
Sure. So the show is up right now. It opened in late September, and it's on view until March 15th of 2026 at the Heckscher Museum. And I'm not at liberty to say the specific museums it's touring to, but I can tell you the show will then go to Chicago, Cincinnati, and Charlottesville, Virginia. So if you can't get to New York City, check out the internet in the next few weeks, and we'll be announcing these other museum presentations of her work.
Oh, that is amazing. I love it. So if you're in New York, you can check it out now, but it's going to be coming to Chicago, and I'm excited about that. So listeners, check links in the show notes. Be sure, if you're in the area, check it out. It is a free show to look at and absolutely amazing work. Thank you once again. I really appreciate your taking the time. Karli Wurzelbacher, I loved getting to learn from you about an artist that I wish I had known sooner. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyle.
This concludes this week's episode of Who Arted, part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. If you found this tolerable, please leave a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find images of the work being discussed this week and every week on social media at Who Arted Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok, and of course on the website whoartedpodcast.com. Podcast done.